Sometimes, a wrong choice can change everything. This is the story of someone who had to face the past and deal with the consequences of their mistakes. A story of reunions, regrets, and second chances. If you've ever wondered if it's possible to fix what was broken, this story is for you. Let's begin. On a bustling Friday morning, Chicago's airport buzzed with hurried people. Brian Thompson, a 35-year-old businessman, was heading towards his boarding gate, dressed in an elegant suit and carrying a leather briefcase. Despite being a successful millionaire, he felt a void that all the money in the world couldn't fill. As he walked, checking his gold watch, he was confronted with a sight that made him stop abruptly. A woman with brown hair passed by, holding the hand of a boy around 10 years old. Brian froze. He knew that face. "Stacye," he murmured in disbelief. But it wasn't just the sight of Stacye that shocked him. The boy beside her was like a reflection of his own past. The same green eyes, messy blonde hair, and even the way he walked reminded Brian of his own childhood. A painful memory hit him hard. 10 years ago, he had left Stacye without any explanation, just a cold letter on the kitchen table. Brian couldn't take his eyes off the boy. A terrifying thought crossed his mind. Was Stacye pregnant? He felt a lump in his throat, and a wave of guilt washed over him. Perhaps he hadn't just abandoned his wife, but also a child. With his heart racing, Brian tried to approach Stacye and the boy. He needed to talk to them, to understand what had happened. But the crowd prevented him from reaching them, and suddenly, they disappeared from his sight. While trying to collect himself, a flight attendant asked if he was okay, but Brian could barely hear her words. His phone rang. It was Rachel, his current wife. He ignored the call, still in shock from what had just happened. The flight was about to depart, but Brian made an impulsive decision. He wouldn't board. He needed to find Stacye and uncover the truth. He took a taxi and, with his mind racing, called Steve, an old friend and private detective. Steve answered, and Brian quickly explained everything, from the unexpected encounter to his suspicion about the boy. Brian knew his life was about to change dramatically. For the first time in many years, success and wealth seemed insignificant. As the taxi drove through the streets of Chicago, Brian couldn't stop thinking about how his life had changed 10 years ago. He remembered meeting Rachel at a hotel bar in New York. At that time, he was frustrated, struggling to close a big deal. Rachel appeared like a seductive storm, full of promises of success. She charmed him with her confidence and ambition, offering the luxurious life he had always desired. Gradually, he drifted away from Stacye, who was just a dedicated nurse and his loving wife. Stacye, on the other hand, never understood why Brian wanted more. To her, happiness didn't lie in wealth or status. But for Brian, Rachel represented everything he thought he needed: power, prestige, and money. On a cold autumn night, Brian made a drastic decision. He waited for Stacye to fall asleep, packed his bags, and left a short, cold letter. "I can't go on like this. I need more out of life than you can give me. Please don't look for me. Brian." Brian left without looking back, heading to the airport and the new life Rachel promised him. He never knew that just a few days later, Stacye would discover she was pregnant. She spent nights crying, not knowing how she would face the future alone. Back in the present, Brian arrived at Steve's office. Desperate, he spilled the entire story, describing his encounter at the airport and his suspicions about the boy. Steve listened intently and then began asking questions. "Brian, do you have any idea what you're doing? This could change everything in your life." Brian replied, determined, "I know, but I need to find out the truth. Do whatever it takes." Steve began the investigation, and days later, he brought the first pieces of information. Stacye still lived in the same neighborhood, in a modest house on a quiet street called Maple Street. And yes, she had a son, Noah, 10 years old, who attended the local school. Brian felt like he had been punched in the gut upon hearing those words. It was true. He had a son he had never met. Steve continued, "Stacye is dating a man named Mark. He seems to be very present in their lives." Jealousy consumed him, but Brian knew he had no right to feel that way. He had made his choices. Now, all he wanted was to try to correct his mistakes. Brian began visiting Stacye's neighborhood. He would park his car on a nearby street and watch from a distance. He saw Noah going to school, playing in the yard, and laughing with Mark, who seemed like a devoted father. With each moment he observed, the regret weighed heavier on him. On a sunny afternoon, Brian finally gathered the courage to get out of the car. He walked down the street, trying to appear casual. When Stacye came out to water the plants, their eyes met. Stacye dropped the watering can. "Brian," she murmured, incredulous. Brian tried to explain, but Stacye was furious. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice trembling. He stammered, saying he needed to see Noah, to understand, to fix things. But Stacye didn't want to listen. "You don't have that right," Stacye interrupted, her voice heavy with anger and sadness. "You abandoned him before you even knew he existed." Brian tried to defend himself, but he knew there was no justification. That's when Mark arrived, and seeing the tense situation, he approached Stacye protectively. His presence intensified Brian's feelings of loss and jealousy, but he knew he couldn't blame anyone but himself. Brian didn't give up. He began discreetly observing Stacye and Noah's routine. He watched from afar, trying to figure out how he could get closer. One day, while Noah was riding his bike, a car suddenly appeared out of nowhere. Without thinking, Brian ran and pushed Noah out of the way, both of them falling onto the grass. "Are you okay?" Brian asked, his heart racing. Noah, still shaken, quickly thanked him and left. After the tense encounter with Brian, Stacye realized she needed to have a conversation with Noah. That very night, she sat down with her son and honestly explained who that man was and what he meant to their lives. Noah listened in silence, still processing his mother's words. He found the situation strange. After all, that man was just a distant figure he had never heard of before. However, as time passed, Noah's curiosity began to grow. Who was his father? Why had he returned now? Stacye noticed Noah's restlessness, and despite all the pain she carried, she knew she had to leave the past behind. Brian was Noah's father, and despite everything that had happened, denying her son the chance to know his father could be even more painful. So Stacye cautiously decided to allow Brian to gradually get closer. She set clear boundaries and kept a watchful eye, but she didn't impose unnecessary barriers. She wanted to protect Noah from further hurt, and for that, it was essential that this approach be light and without pressure. Brian, realizing the opportunity he was being given, made himself present in a discreet way, not forcing interactions, just marking his presence gradually. Seeing Brian's effort brought Stacye a faint hope, a spark that maybe he was really trying to make amends. And for Noah, each brief encounter planted a small seed of curiosity about who his father might be. Rachel, on the other hand, was furious with Brian's new attitude and his constant absences. Feeling like she was losing control, she began investigating his life, determined to use anything against him. Their relationship had already been deteriorating for quite some time, something that had been built on superficial grounds, driven by ambition and money. After all the turmoil and internal change Brian was going through, he decided it was time to make firm decisions. One day, Brian finally confronted Rachel and told her their relationship was over. Rachel threatened him, saying she would ruin his life, but Brian was resolute. He wanted to take new directions in his life, and staying with Rachel no longer made sense. He confessed all his financial wrongdoings to his lawyer, knowing that it could lead to bankruptcy and even prison. For him, the truth was the only way to start over. After his public confession, Brian faced the consequences. His assets were frozen, and his business partners abandoned him. He called Stacye to apologize, acknowledging the impact his actions had caused on her and Noah's lives. Despite everything, Brian didn't give up. He continued trying to connect with Noah, even if awkwardly. Finally, one afternoon at the park, Stacye and Noah approached Brian, and the boy for the first time asked a direct question. "Why did you come back now?" Brian, with tears in his eyes, confessed his mistakes, admitting that he had made the worst choice of his life. Brian's relationship with Stacye and Noah was far from perfect, but there was hope. They began to get to know each other again, with many difficult conversations and a long road to rebuild trust. After that meeting at the park, where Noah had his first honest conversation with Brian, something changed forever. Brian found himself reflecting deeply on all his choices, mistakes, and especially on what he had left behind. One afternoon, he asked Stacye for a serious conversation while Noah played further away. Sitting on a park bench, Brian seemed hesitant but determined. He took a deep breath and began, "Stacye, I need to say something that I've been carrying for years. If I could go back in time, I would do everything differently. I would never have left you, never hurt you that way. I look at what you've built with Mark and Noah, and I realize that I could have been that guy. I could be by your side, happy with you and our son. But I ruined everything, and now I have to accept this reality." He paused, his voice slightly choked with emotion. "As painful as it is, I'm genuinely happy for you. For everything you've overcome and for having a happy family now. You didn't deserve anything I did. And if there's something good in all of this, it's knowing that you managed to move on, be strong, and find someone who values and respects you." Stacye listened silently, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She took a deep breath before replying, "Brian, you left me at the most difficult moment of my life, and for a long time, I carried the pain and the hurt. There were days when I didn't know if I could go on. But somehow, life was generous to me. I found strengths I didn't even know I had, and I managed to give Noah the love and care he needed." She looked directly into Brian's eyes, her expression gentle yet firm. "The truth is, it took me a while, but I managed to forgive you. Forgiving was more important to me than anything else. And today, I see that it was necessary. You can't change the past, Brian, but I see you're trying to be someone better for Noah, and that's what matters most now." They sat in silence for a few moments, absorbing each word. There was a deep sincerity between them, a mutual understanding that the past had left its marks, but that both had moved on in their own ways. In the end, despite all the pain and challenges, Brian and Stacye managed to build a new relationship based on friendship and respect. They became great parents to Noah, working together to provide the best for their son without letting the mistakes of the past define their lives. And in a way, by accepting what they couldn't change, both found a path to move forward with peace in their hearts. The story of Brian and Stacye is proof that love can exist in many forms and isn't bound only to an ideal of perfect romance. Brian learned the hard way that the choices we make can take us away from what truly matters, but also that it's never too late to try to right a wrong and seek redemption. The love that once united Brian and Stacye didn't disappear, but rather changed, evolving into something deeper and more mature. Stacye found in Mark a new partner, someone with whom she could rebuild her life, and Brian had to deal with the consequences of his actions, accepting his guilt and striving to be the father Noah deserved. This new kind of love, built on friendship, respect, and a partnership focused on their son, shows that love can be reborn in different ways, even in difficult situations. In the end, the story teaches us that true love is not about possession or perfection, but about accepting the past, offering sincere forgiveness, and dedicating oneself to cultivating relationships based on truth and compassion. Brian and Stacye discovered that love can transform into strong bonds of friendship and commitment, where they both supported and respected each other for Noah's sake, proving that mature love is capable of healing the deepest wounds and bringing new hope for the future. If you enjoyed this touching story of love, forgiveness, and redemption, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. This way, you help keep this space where we share stories that touch the heart. And of course, share it with your friends so they can be moved too. We'd love to hear your opinion, so leave a comment below and tell us what you think, or even suggest ideas for the next stories. Let's keep going on this journey full of emotions together. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you next time.